Thank you, Governor, so much for taking the time to be with us today during this especially intense time. What we're seeing with the protests over George Floyd going on nationwide, around the country, but also in your state, what is your message to the protesters?
Yeah, it's a remarkable chapter in our country right now. And God rest George Floyd's soul, a guy who, for so many reasons, should be alive and well today. My message is to folks who peacefully protest, you have every right to do so. We respect your right. We encourage it. I mean, this is the first year of the 5th century since slavery first came to our shores, and the stain of racism lingers and remains, and the gap between the privileged and the pained is wide, and folks are angry. They are incredibly frustrated. Who could blame them? They have every right to protest, and we encourage it. Having said that, please do it peacefully, and please, if at all possible, do it in a way that doesn't reignite the coronavirus. So face coverings, try to keep some distance would be helpful. We have, knock on wood, we've had an enormous amount of protests. I think today we have 19 alone. That puts us over 100 since George passed. And for the overwhelming amount of those protests, we've had no incidents. We've had very few challenges. It's a huge credit to the protesters, to elected officials, communities of faith and their leaders, to law enforcement. Folks have done the right thing. We need them to continue to do the right thing.
That's certainly a contrast to what we've been seeing in New York and even DC, where there are these violent clashes with protesters, often instigated by police. I've heard some activists in Newark, for example, say that it hasn't happened in New Jersey because of this sort of history of community policing. It's not like this happened overnight. So how much of that do you attribute to law enforcement, and how much do you attribute to the protesters?
Oh, I think it takes a village. Everybody deserves credit for the peaceful results so far. I will say with some amount of pride, and I want to give our Attorney General a huge shout out, Gurbir Grewal. I think he's the finest in the nation. Community policing has been a priority for me, and it has been for him since day one. And it's not just words, but it's actions. I signed last year, I think, one of the nation's most forward-leaning independent prosecutor bills, so that if there's any death or if there's any fired weapons that involve police, the investigation goes to an entirely separate independent channel. We've spent an enormous amount of energy, and again, the Attorney General has led this in many respects, working to strengthen relations between law enforcement and communities, particularly communities of color, but not exclusively. And I think that is bearing fruit as we witness this. Again, I'm not going to declare victory, by the way. This is when you have 19 or 20 protests a day, with even many more so planned for this coming weekend. God bless George Floyd. He's being put to rest on Tuesday in Houston. This is not going away anytime soon. So far, so good, and the credit goes to all sides, and we just have to keep it up.
I understand that Newark police also made a tactical decision to not put police out in military-style riot gear, which, again, we've seen so much of in New York. So will that continue to be the case this weekend?
Yeah, I can't speak for Mayor Baraka or Director Ambrose, and they've done an extraordinary job in Newark. But that feels like that's feels like that's a sensible step. I'll tell you something else that we've stood for day one. I'm a former national board member of the NAACP, and while I'm never going to ever claim to have walked in the shoes of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, we have been passionate about a civil rights and social justice agenda, and a big piece of that has been gun safety, and that is something that we have aggressively pursued, and God willing, again, we're seeing some of the fruit born from that in these challenging times, and I hope it stays that way.
So you said that you want to bring, I think the quote is transformational change to community policing and police culture in New Jersey. What does that look like in practice?
Well, I think it looks like something that probably right now no American state has achieved. This is not, we're also recovering from the COVID-19. We're still in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, I announced 92 more fatalities today, but we have now for over a month been trying to plan for how do we get back to some sort of normalcy. And equity is a big part of that. And making it not just a stronger state, as we've said from day one, but a fairer state. And I was, we had a conversation about this yesterday, and the phrase I used, and this goes for policing and reimagining policing. For instance, we announced we're going to require each and every member of law enforcement to go through a licensing process, which right now we have not done in New Jersey, and we're going to do that. And that's a really good step in the right direction. The way I've phrased this, not just in law enforcement, but as a general matter, we're not trying to get back on our feet and back to the place we were. We're trying to get back on our feet and go to a place that we've never been before. And I hope in our own small way, New Jersey can lead that way.
I also saw the Attorney General say that the use of force policies for the police will be updated for the first time in 20 years this year. Why do you think that
Yeah,
it took so long?
that's a good question. I've only been there for 2 of those 20 as governor, but shame on New Jersey, both sides of the aisle, for not getting to it sooner. But we are going to get to it. Use of force policies last updated in the year 2000. I need not repeat the observation that a lot's changed since then, and everything from 9/11 to George Floyd's tragic killing and everything in between. And it's high time we updated them. I'm thrilled that we're doing it.
One other reform that we're starting to see out of other cities, like LA, for example, is that they announced that they're cutting maybe $100 million from their police budget. So does New Jersey have any plans to do the same?
As a state matter, no, we don't have plans to cut money from the budget due to this particular tragedy. We are in a big budget crunch, however, from COVID-19, and we desperately, not just in law enforcement, but across the entirety of government, desperately need federal direct cash assistance. That's because of the virus and the economic impact and fiscal impact that it's had. And we need that coming out of Congress, direct into states. Otherwise, we're going to be laying off police, fire, educators, EMS, healthcare workers, and that will become a reality if we don't get that cash.
We're seeing some frightening images out of DC that we mentioned earlier, because Trump has threatened to also send in the US military into states to quell protest. And a lot of governors were quick to say, we don't need that. What was your reaction to that?
In the National Guard in New Jersey?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, listen, the president asked me directly on a video call on Monday before this disgraceful photo op, and I said, listen, it's not I'm not making a philosophical statement about the National Guard. By the way, our National Guard is stretched to the bone right now on dealing with COVID. I have to say, as a parenthetical, both in our testing sites as well as in our long-term care facilities. So it's not like we've got a lot of folks sitting back with their feet up. But I said it's not a philosophical matter. The reality is that between the state police, county law enforcement, local law enforcement, and then the mutual aid agreements that all these towns and counties have, in other words, calling your neighbor and saying, listen, I need you to come in to help me. When you add all that up, we are, at least for the time being, and this could change. I hope it doesn't. But for the time being, at least we have what we need.
Now, you're chair of the Democratic Governors Association. We heard that Trump on that call said a lot of governors are being weak right now. He's also going after particular other Democratic governors, like in Michigan and North Carolina. So what conversations are you having with other governors about responding to these attacks?
Well, listen, I'm having conversations with governors all the time. And by the way, more Democratic than Republican, but frankly, both sides of the aisle. And up until 10 days ago, those conversations for the past 2 to 3 months were exclusively about COVID-19 best practices, and more recently about how do we together on both sides of the aisle get Congress to get that direct cash assistance that I referred to a short while ago, and that continues to be a big theme and a big need. There's no question that folks have reacted badly to this divisiveness over the past 10 days that's come out of the White House. There's just no other way to put it. And that has begun to filter down into, the states, and it will undoubtedly have an impact on politics and the elections this fall, first and foremost on the election for president. But it will also impact governors. As a partisan matter, Democrats are defending 4 states this fall. North Carolina, you mentioned, is one of them. That's a big battleground state for the presidency. It's a big defense for the Democratic Governors Association. There's a U.S. Senate seat that is at stake there. That's a good example of a state with a lot at play this fall. And I'm sure this is going to impact that. And Governor Roy Cooper has done an extraordinary job, both with COVID as well as in this tragedy in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, and dealing with the systemic racism in our country, and in his case, in North Carolina. And I think folks look at that and they say, you know what, this is a guy who's doing a heck of a job under extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
Now, we know that New Jersey has been second hardest hit in the nation in terms of coronavirus infections and deaths after New York. I believe there's a phase 2 reopening now planned for June 15th. So what criteria are you looking at to make that decision to reopen while the pandemic is ongoing?
Yeah, it's a great question. The healthcare metrics that, we're Moneyball, we're data-driven folks. And so for all the emotions and all the humanity associated with this, and there is an overwhelming amount. It's why I speak to families every day and eulogize several every day to make sure this never becomes just about data. Having said that, we watch the data very, very carefully and make our decisions based on that. The metrics that we care about, hospitalizations, new hospitalizations, folks in the intensive care unit, folks on ventilators, what our positivity rate is on a spot basis, like right now, what percentage of tests are coming back positive, the so-called RT, which is a different way of measuring how fast the virus is either spreading or not spreading. All of those metrics now for several weeks have been improving. And those are the ones that allow us to feel confident we can enter that second phase. As you rightfully point out, June 15th, we'll have outdoor dining, all retail, both essential and non-essential. Shortly thereafter, nail and hair salons and barber shops. I hope soon thereafter, gyms and fitness centers. I hope sooner than later, indoor dining and other steps. But we got to do this incrementally. We've already opened parks and beaches and construction and curbside pickup at non-essential retail and a whole lot of other things. We want to continue to make progress, assuming the health data allows us to.
Are you worried about having to close back down or possibly regress, though, because of all of the public protests that we're seeing?
Listen, I hope, please God, we're going through hell once. I hope we don't have to go through it more than once. My fear is that even if we bat 1,000, this is the sort of virus that has evidenced, based on its predecessor comparisons, that it may well come back. I do want folks, when they're peacefully protesting, to wear a face cover and stay apart from each other. It's part of the reason why we have ramped up our testing. We're now #1 in the nation per capita testing. We're going to be in the same place on contact tracing. And the reason I say that is the virus in all likelihood will come back. That's not really the question. The question is, how quickly can you spot it? How quickly can you track down who else might have it? How quickly can you isolate it, basically wall it off so that it doesn't become a bigger community spread? And that's what we're going to try to do.
Now, you mentioned a lot of data in your decision to reopen in different phases, which I think is important. And I understand that some members of the state's pandemic response team actually wrote a letter saying that they felt the state government wasn't paying enough attention to data or public health experts' advice. So then what is your response to that?
Yeah, it's an anonymous letter. I have no idea who wrote it. It's a little bit of palace intrigue. Frankly, I spend no time focused on that. I spend my days morning, noon, and night, and my team on trying to save as many lives as we can and trying as best we can at the same time to get our state back up and running. And that's my entire focus.
So you do feel that the data that you've been paying attention to is recommended by public health experts?
There's no question. No question. I'm not a medical expert. I'm relying on experts, both in New Jersey and frankly, I consult and we consult folks around the country and around the world, indeed. There's no question. The data matters. The right data matters, and we're using that data to make our decisions.
Now, just as the final question, you did mention how you eulogize certain New Jerseyans who have passed away from COVID. I saw that you actually tweet out some of their photos, names, and stories. Why do you think that that's important to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reason, very simply, is this is so overwhelmingly, which per our prior discussion here about data,
Mm.
we've got to constantly remind folks, including remind myself, that this is about now almost 12,000 precious lives lost in our state alone. And the reason I call those families every day, and sometimes those are really tough conversations. I spoke to a gal today who's lost both of her parents, and she's just finished up her first year in college, and she's the only kid. You can imagine what that's like. But people have to know about these folks. They have to know that these were extraordinary lives lived, and these are extraordinary losses. So that this is, while it is in so many respects all about data, that at the same time, it's never only about data.
Well, Governor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Versha. Take care of yourself.